Now that we have isolated the part of terrain that we want to blow up, we are ready to set up some grains. Sourcing grains is much easier than what you would expect. So let's do it together. I'm going to find my null called outChunk, and I'm going to create a grain source node. I will connect it to the null and make it visible. For now, I'm going to hide the terrain. So depending on the size of the object that's sourcing the grains, you may not see anything at the moment, but this has an easy fix. Probably the most important property of the grain source is the point separation. And at this moment, it is too high from the geometry that we want to convert into grains. So let's reduce this value, say to 0.1. And now we can see some points in the viewport. And these points will be our grain particles. It's as easy as that. Now, if you take a look at the geometry spreadsheet, you may notice that a p-scale attribute has been created. This will be very important for the grain simulation later on. Just notice for now that this value is linked to this point separation that we changed earlier. So if I change the value to 0.05, you will notice that now the p-scale is 0.025. So basically the p-scale is the radius of this value. Think as a point separation as a radius of spheres that are touching each other. So for now, let's go with 0.01. I'll go back to my scene view. And I will show you another important attribute. So if you scroll down a bit, you will see the jitter scale. Turn that on, and this will randomize the position of the points so we don't have a perfectly uniform grid. Now, technically, this is all we need to generate our simulation. But there's one more thing that I want to do before I go into DOPS. And that's transferring the color of the terrain into my particles. That way they will merge seamlessly when we render them. So let's do that now. So I will quickly go into the material context, create a classic shader called the shader terrain material, and let's add a texture here under the color. So click on the use map option, and from my recently used file list here to the right, I will select the UV grid gray. But here you can add whatever texture that you want. It could be a sand texture for the terrain, or probably concrete or dirt. For now I will use the grid because it will be easier to see the colors. So let's go back to our object context, and let's add the material to this mortar explosion object. Now what we need to do is add the same UVs for both the terrain and the chunk. So let's do that now. Add a UV texture node. And remember we have a camera. Let's look through the camera now. What I'm going to do is project the texture through this point of view. And that's a common practice, for example, when you have a back plate or a picture and you want to project the color of the plate into your geometry. So let's connect the node to the terrain, and under the UV texture properties, look for texture type and find perspective from camera. And here under the camera parameter, look for camera 1. So let's take a look at the terrain. And here we have our texture. So let's copy the UVs onto the chunk. So at this point, we're sure they both have the exact same UVs. And what I'm going to do next is project the color of these UVs to the point attribute of the geometry. And for that, we can use an attribute from map node. So let's connect it here under the UV texture. And we need to make sure that here under the texture map property, we have the same texture as in the material we just created. So in this case, I will select the UV grid gray. Now, if I turn off the display materials, you will notice that there's some grays here, and actually you can see it here below. These colors are coming from the texture that we added here. Now there's a slight problem. Here on the cap, we don't have enough points to capture the detail of the texture. So we need to subdivide this cap so we have enough points. For that, I'm going to use a divide node. So let's connect this node just before the attribute from map. I'm going to turn on the breaker polygons and change the size on all three axes to 0.05. And here we're starting to see some colors. So let's go lower than this. 0.005 should be more than enough. And now with the colors of our texture as point color attribute, we can transfer this color onto our points. So here I'm going to add an attribute transfer node, connect it to the grains, and connect the chunk to the second input. So by default, we will be transferring the color from one object to the particles. So now we're ready to create a simulation.